Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Today, we are witnessing a moment that is not simply about one missile, one drone, or one attack. It is about a shift, a global political shift that many powerful nations never expected to face. And when shifts like this occur, they do not whisper. They shake the world. Yemen's unexpected strike changed more than headlines. It disrupted assumptions that have shaped international politics for decades. For years, power was measured by economic strength, defense budgets, and global alliances. The world was taught to believe that only the wealthy and technologically superior nations shape global events. Yet here we stand watching a country that has endured war, isolation, and economic collapse demonstrate that power does not always follow those traditional rules. The shock does not come from the scale of the attack, but from the fact that it happened at all. It forced leaders, analysts, and governments to confront an uncomfortable reality. The global balance of power is shifting in ways that no one can fully predict or control. This moment demands attention because it rewrites the psychological map of international influence. When a nation considered weak finds the capacity to act decisively, it sends a message far louder than any weapon. It challenges the narrative that some nations are destined to simply endure and absorb pressure indefinitely. It challenges the expectation that suffering leads to silence, and it challenges the belief that military or economic dominance alone guarantees control. The world has seen powerful nations use their strength to impose conditions on weaker countries, expecting obedience or at least resignation. But what happens when the weaker side decides it will not play that role anymore? That is the question the world must now ask. A nation like Yemen, with limited resources and ongoing internal conflict, should by traditional analysis have no strategic influence. Yet reality has shown something else. When a population feels it has nothing left to lose, when hardship becomes constant and endurance becomes identity, the willingness to resist takes on a power that cannot be measured by satellites, missiles, or military rankings. That kind of resolve is unpredictable. And unpredictability is the greatest source of discomfort for global powers. There is also a symbolic dimension to this moment that cannot be ignored. For decades, the narrative has been that certain states dictate the geopolitical environment while others merely react to it. But Yemen's actions represent a break from that narrative, a refusal to accept the world order as it is presented. It suggests that agency is not a privilege given by stronger nations. It can be claimed, and once claimed, it changes the strategic landscape far beyond the immediate event. Leaders and analysts understand this. They recognize that if one nation under immense pressure and limited capacity can assert itself, others will watch, learn, and perhaps act in their own ways. This is where the shockwave becomes global. Nations that believe they could rely on predictable outcomes must now reconsider their strategies. Nations that were expected to remain silent may now find new courage, and nations that were once considered untouchable are now confronted with the reality that power is not absolute. It is conditional, fragile, and constantly challenged. When this realization spreads, the political atmosphere across entire regions begins to shift. Confidence is questioned. Influence is reconsidered, and the rules that once seemed clear begin to blur. And this is precisely why the event resonates far beyond the borders of the countries involved. It signals that we may be entering an era where smaller states, non-state groups, and regional players do not wait for permission or alignment with global superpowers before acting. The world order becomes more fluid, more contested, and more difficult to control. Decisions made in capitals that once shaped global outcomes with ease now carry greater risk. The margin for error becomes smaller. The consequences of miscalculation become larger. This is why leaders around the world are watching closely, not because they are concerned about the direct scale of Yemen's action, but because they understand the psychological and strategic wave it sends into the global system. Power is no longer simply about who has the biggest arsenal or the wealthiest economy. Power is also about the willingness to challenge existing hierarchies, the determination to act despite pressure, and the capacity to shift the meaning of what is possible. The moment Yemen acted, the world saw that the hierarchy of influence is not fixed. It is negotiable. And whenever power becomes negotiable, the future becomes uncertain. That uncertainty is now spreading across regions, alliances, and strategic calculations. It is a slow, quiet, but unmistakable transformation, and the world is adjusting to it, whether it is prepared or not. Israel has long been viewed as a nation fortified both technologically and strategically, an advanced military, a powerful intelligence network, and layers of international alliances that reinforce its security posture. Yet the moment Yemen successfully executed an unexpected strike, something deeper than physical defenses was affected. What was shaken was the perception of invulnerability, and perception in global politics is sometimes more decisive than hardware, funding, or alliances. The shock did not come merely from the fact that Israel was targeted. It came from the realization that the realities of warfare and strategic defense have evolved beyond traditional calculations. When a country with globally recognized security capabilities experiences a breach, the world begins to ask questions about the limits of modern defense systems and, more importantly, about the assumptions that have guided international strategy for decades. Consider how the global community has historically understood Israel's defense capabilities. Systems like Iron Dome and other advanced interception networks were often highlighted as near impenetrable shields, symbols of technological superiority. Politicians, analysts, and observers repeated the narrative that Israel existed within a sphere of military reassurance. Yet what was rarely discussed is the human element of defense. Strategy can adapt, technologies can be countered, and no system is without weak points. The Yemen strike revealed that even the highest tier of military protection is not flawless. And when the world sees such a fortress show cracks, the psychological effect is profound. This is where the situation becomes more compelling. The strength of a nation is not defined solely by its ability to defend territory, but by the confidence others have in that defense. Power requires belief. Security requires reputation. Once belief is weakened, even slightly, strategic stability begins to change. The question shifts from, can Israel defend itself, to, if Israel can be reached, who else can? That single shift in questioning carries more geopolitical weight than any missile ever could. The strike did not need to inflict massive destruction to be effective. Its success was symbolic. It pierced not just airspace, but certainty. And certainty has always been one of Israel's most valuable strategic assets. Governments noticed. Military analysts noticed. Regional actors noticed. When one state demonstrates that an advanced security network can be challenged, it inspires others who have long believed they had no chance of altering outcomes. This is how a single action can influence an entire region without needing to be large in scale. There is another dimension that adds to the global reaction. Israel's security approach has long rested not only on defensive capability, but also on deterrence. The belief that striking Israel would trigger severe consequences. But when the actor is a country already living under hardship, already engaged in struggle, and already accustomed to loss, the deterrence equation changes. If the fear of consequences is diminished, the balance of strategic power shifts. When a nation acts regardless of potential retaliation, it is operating outside the expected logic of strategic threat. And that unpredictability is what unsettles larger powers the most. One must also consider how societies inside Israel interpret this moment. Public psychology matters. A nation's stability rests not only on walls and weapons, but on the confidence of its citizens. When citizens begin to question the reliability of their protection, the government faces internal pressure, political, social, and strategic. Leaders must then justify decisions, redirect narratives, and reassure populations whose trust may be shaken. The effects ripple inward as much as outward. This incident also triggers reassessment among Israel's allies. Nations that support Israel may now be evaluating whether the regional environment is shifting in ways that require new forms of strategic planning. If the assumption of Israeli security strength is changed even slightly, the policies built around that assumption must be reconsidered as well. And whenever powerful allies begin to reassess, global diplomacy adjusts itself quietly, steadily, and sometimes irreversibly. This is why the event carries weight far beyond the immediate moment. It is not about Yemen overpowering Israel. No analyst would claim such a conclusion. The significance lies in the message that power is not absolute and neither is security. A strike that challenges confidence reshapes the broader landscape of international relations. It pushes the world to recognize that no system is immune to adaptation from opponents, no power structure is beyond challenge, and no nation, regardless of its military advantage, is beyond reach. Once a perception breaks even slightly, it does not easily restore itself. The shock was not in the explosion. It was in the realization that even the strongest shields can be touched. The moment Yemen launched its unexpected strike, something subtle but extremely significant began to shift across diplomatic circles, defense offices, and strategic planning rooms throughout the Middle East and beyond. Regional alliances are never fixed. They are living arrangements built on mutual interest, perceived strength, shared threats, and historical memory. When an event disrupts even one piece of that balance, every nation in the region begins recalculating its position. And the shockwave we are witnessing now is not about immediate military escalation. It is about political alignment and strategic reassessment. Nations suddenly find themselves asking who stands where, who benefits from this shift, who becomes vulnerable, and most importantly, who must now rethink their assumptions. For years, Israel has stood closely aligned with Western powers, especially the United States, while Yemen, fractured by conflict, existed in a strained and complex network of regional tensions. Yet the attack demonstrated that influence no longer flows strictly from the strongest to the weakest. It showed that actors previously considered secondary or strategically contained can now assume surprising roles on the regional stage. That single realization forces every state in the region to observe more carefully, speak more cautiously, and act more deliberately. Countries in the Middle East have long operated under the understanding that certain states do not get challenged directly. The expectation was that smaller nations must align themselves carefully to avoid pressure or retaliation. Yet Yemen's action effectively broke that unwritten rule. And when an unwritten rule breaks, it sends tremors far deeper than the visible event itself. It creates a question in the minds of policymakers. If Yemen can take this kind of stand, what might others be willing to do? And if others begin to act, how quickly could the political shape of the region change? These questions are not abstract. Their implications are immediate. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt are all now compelled to evaluate the ripple effect. Some may see this as a threat to their own strategic plans. Others may view it as an opportunity to increase their influence. The Middle East is not simply a region of borders and territories. It is a stage where perceptions of strength determine negotiation power. When perceptions shift, negotiations shift, alliances shift. Priorities shift, and this shift does not only concern governments. Non-state actors, political movements, and resistance groups across the region are watching just as closely. When they see that an established power like Israel can be surprised, they analyze that moment for strategic lessons, symbolic energy, and ideological validation. This is how geopolitical actions evolve into historical turning points, not because of their military size, but because of the psychological encouragement they create. At the same time, global powers outside the region are reassessing as well. The United States must reconsider its strategic calculations, not because it suddenly doubts Israel's strength, but because regional stability is central to its security architecture in the Middle East. Russia and China, both increasingly influential in global diplomacy, are also observing the unfolding situation, aware that any disturbance in the Middle Eastern balance opens new opportunities for repositioning diplomatic influence. Each shift in regional alignment creates openings for negotiation, arms deals, energy agreements, and symbolic partnerships. Meanwhile, European nations, who have long relied on a relatively stable Middle Eastern structure to safeguard energy routes and migration patterns, must now examine how a rise in regional unpredictability could affect their own domestic politics. The movement of alliances in one region often produces social, economic, and political effects in another. Stability in the Middle East has always been globally consequential. Instability is even more so. However, the most compelling aspect of this moment is not the immediate diplomatic maneuvering. It is the quiet conversations occurring behind the public statements. Governments will not openly declare that they are rethinking alliances, but their actions will reveal the shift, changes in military coordination, diplomatic visits, foreign minister statements, subtle shifts in media tone, and redefined foreign aid strategies. These changes are slow at first, almost invisible, but they accumulate, and once accumulated, they become irreversible. This is why Yemen's action cannot be viewed as isolated. It represents a psychological permission slip for realignment. Nations that once felt overshadowed may now see the possibility of asserting themselves. Nations that depended on a predictable hierarchy now see that hierarchy cracking. And once a structure cracks, people begin to test the strength of the pieces. The real transformation is not in what happened, but in what other actors might now believe is possible. The global political environment has always depended on predictability. Nations rely on patterns to negotiate, strategize, and maintain influence. When the world can anticipate outcomes, it feels stable even when tensions are high. But the moment Yemen carried out an unexpected strike, that sense of predictability began to erode. What emerged instead was a reminder that the global order is no longer governed solely by major powers, established alliances, or conventional military logic. Instead, it is increasingly shaped by actors who operate outside expected frameworks, by motivations that are not always based on economic gain or diplomatic approval, and by a willingness to challenge the assumptions that stronger nations have relied upon for decades. This shift creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is the most powerful disruptor in international relations. For years, analysts described the world as bipolar or unipolar, either dominated by one superpower or shaped by competition among a small number of major states. Yet events like this one reveal that the global stage is becoming multipolar, not just in terms of nations, but in terms of influence itself. Influence is no longer limited to governments alone. Non-state groups, regional coalitions, and political movements all now possess the capacity to alter the course of regional and global affairs. And because their decisions are less predictable, the outcomes they generate are harder to manage. The Yemen-Israel incident demonstrates that the world system is transitioning into a phase where power is distributed across many hands, some visible, others not, and where outcomes cannot be easily forecast. This unpredictability forces powerful nations to rethink the way they approach diplomacy, security, and conflict resolution. A system that was once managed through negotiations among elites now requires understanding grassroots motivations, internal political pressures, and ideological movements that cannot be controlled through traditional incentives or threats. When a nation is driven not by material advantage but by identity, resistance, or survival, its decisions are no longer governed by conventional strategic logic. This is what unnerves global powers. They are accustomed to negotiating with actors who have clear economic or political goals. But when the goal becomes symbolic assertion or moral stance, the negotiation framework dissolves. This is also where the shock extends far beyond military implications. Every nation now must consider that their assumptions about deterrence may be outdated. When smaller actors show that they are willing to take risks that larger actors consider too costly, they disrupt the logic that has traditionally stabilized global power balances. Larger nations may respond with pressure, but pressure is less effective when the targeted side has already endured extreme hardship. The fear of loss is the foundation of deterrence. When that foundation weakens, deterrence fails. Observers around the world are now watching to see whether this moment is a singular event or a marker of something larger. History suggests that such actions rarely remain isolated. When one group proves that opposition is possible, others study the method, the outcome, and the reaction. They analyze whether the risks taken were met with overwhelming force or whether they resulted in newfound legitimacy or influence. If the result is anything less than decisive suppression, the act becomes a reference point, a precedent, a model. And in geopolitics, models are powerful. In many regions, there are movements, factions, and populations that feel unheard or marginalized by the global system. They see themselves reflected in the struggles of others. A symbolic act in one country can become an emotional catalyst in another. That is why global uncertainty grows, not simply because something unexpected happened, but because the meaning of that event spreads. It is interpreted, emotionally absorbed, and replicated. What makes the current moment especially consequential is that the major global powers are already experiencing internal challenges, economic strains, political divisions, shifting alliances. When global powers are internally unsettled, they become less able to impose structure onto the international system. And when their influence weakens, the room for unexpected actors to shape events expands. This is why the Yemen strike resonates as part of a broader transformation. It does not redefine the global order in a single day. Rather, it marks a subtle but undeniable shift in how global affairs will be conducted moving forward. It suggests that the world is entering an era where outcomes cannot be predicted simply by looking at military power, economic size, or diplomatic alliances. Instead, outcomes will increasingly depend on the motivations, resilience, and strategic creativity of actors who operate beyond the traditional centers of power. The unpredictability of this new phase is not temporary. It is structural. It signals that global politics are no longer shaped by control, but by challenge. And once challenge becomes normalized, the world does not return to what it was before.